They used a 500-pound bomb. There were those in the military who said, don't use a 500-pound bomb. You'll miss the head of Hamas. Use a 2-ton bomb. If they had used a 2-ton bomb, post-analysis said, well, they would have gotten the head of Hamas, who was a perfectly legitimate military target. They used a 500-pound bomb. Some people were injured and killed in the process. It was an attempt to be proportional. Proportionality is what military law calls for. One can be critical of Israel. By the way, all throughout my book, you haven't heard this from Mr. Finkelstein, I am critical of Israel. I am critical of the occupation. I'm critical of the settlements. I'm critical of the overreaction often to terrorist attacks. I'm critical of targeted assassinations that bring about too many civilian casualties. But I insist still on making a distinction between targeting civilians deliberately and going after a combatant knowing that you're going to kill civilians.
May I answer that? I think I haven't had a chance to speak for about 10 minutes. May I answer that point?
Norman Finkelstein.
On page 146 of Mr. Dershowitz's book, he gives examples of how Israelis are careful not to target civilian casualties.
That's right.
Let me just read the paragraph. 3 stories illustrate the Israeli commitment to proportionality and to avoiding unnecessary civilian casualties. The first involves an Israeli attack directed against Salah Shahadeh, a leading Hamas commander who was responsible for hundreds of terrorist bombings. On several occasions, the army passed up opportunities to attack him because he was with his wife or children. Each time, Shahadeh's life was spared. He directed more suicide bombings against Israel. In other words, Israel was prepared to risk the lives of its own civilians in order to spare the lives of Palestinian civilians, including the wife of a major terrorist. Now, when I read that, I was kind of shocked. If Mr. Dershowitz knew who Salah Shahadeh was. Some people may remember in July 2001 or 2, can't remember now, the United States Israel dropped a 1-ton bomb on a civilian neighborhood in Gaza. They dropped a 1-ton bomb on the civilian neighborhood in Gaza, killing 9 children, in order to get who? In order to get Salah Shahadeh, the very person Mr. Dershowitz uses as an example of careful Israeli proportionality to avoid unnecessary civilian casualties.
That's exactly right.
Was the most shocking example to date of Israel, in order to kill a so-called terrorist leader, dropping it on a densely populated civilian neighborhood, a 1-ton bomb.
Okay, let me respond
to that.
That's
a very strange example.
That's a very good example. Let me respond to that. The Israeli military then did an analysis, and they discovered, of course, that when they dropped that bomb and killed those people, they had no idea that those people were in the building, and the people who made the decision to drop the bomb were criticized and disciplined for it. The point I make is when they knew for sure that family members were there, they withheld doing it. That doesn't deny the fact that on occasion they will accidentally make a decision that's wrong. The difference is between deliberateness, willfulness. Now, I know I was scheduled to be on until 9, and I have a 10 o'clock interview elsewhere, so we only have another 2 minutes.
That was a nice fairy tale. Dropping a 1-ton bomb on a densely populated civilian neighborhood in Gaza, and they had no idea that civilians would be there.
Well,
and then he goes on, then he goes on to fantasy number 2, that those who did it were disciplined. Really, Mr. Dershowitz, I'd love the evidence for that. I mean, if I could get $10,000 for every one of your fraudulent statements, I could be rich not only for this life, but, even though I don't believe in an afterlife, for 10 lives to come. Well, every word out of your mouth is sheer fraud.
So far, we've had an hour and 45 minutes, and again, we've come up with.
Here comes the lawyer's summary. Prepare.
Right, a full quote that correctly quoted from Mark Twain, a possible typo. Disagreements with various organizations, and mostly, by the way, agreements with me about conclusions, but disagreements about whether or not I use this source or that source. I mean, so far, I think I'm maybe prepared to raise the offer now, because I've now gotten the most rigorous. I mean, I really appreciate, first of all, thank you for reading my book so carefully. I really appreciate that. I like people reading my book carefully. I urge others to read it carefully. I acknowledge, by the way, I found another mistake. When I described the man who Yasser Arafat personally ordered the murder of an American diplomat in the Sudan in the early 1970s, I got his name wrong. Yes, I did. I called him Cleo something or other, and he was Cleo something or other. Yes, you're going to find, any time a book is written, you're going to find a couple of typos. I maintain again, I did not make a willful, material misstatement of fact. I disagree with B'Tselem. I disagree with some human rights organizations. I agree with a lot of what they say, but the main thrust of my point is agreed to by the vast majority of Israelis, and I want to emphasize that I'm not making the right-wing case for Israel. I'm not making the conservative case. I'm making the case that Michael Walzer makes for Israel. I'm making the case that Shimon Peres makes for Israel. I'm making the case
I agree with that.
that Amnon Rubinstein makes for Israel.
For sure.
I'm making the two-state solution
The case that Joan Peters makes.
No. And we have to understand that Norman Finkelstein stands at the extreme of the case against Israel, against the two-state solution, against resolving these issues. So we're having a mainstream Israeli case made versus an extremist case that almost nobody in Israel, not the Palestinian Authority, accepts. And the best prospect for peace in the Middle East is going to be a two-state solution. And I'm going to end the way I started. When the Palestinian leadership wants their own state, standing side by side with Israel, there will be a two-state solution. But so long as they want to see the destruction of the Israeli state more than they want to see their own state, which has been true
Alan
since
Dershowitz, I'm going to
1917,
interrupt only
we're gonna have a
because
problem.
you're going to have to leave, and since we gave you that opportunity at the beginning to sum up your main points, I'm going to give Norman Finkelstein the conclusion to an audience who, most of whom who have not read this book in
hope they
terms
will.
of the general points.
Well, I think the obvious point is it's no more possible to have a debate with Mr. Dershowitz about the Israel-Palestine conflict, and it's possible to have a discussion with a Holocaust denier about the Nazi Holocaust. The book he wrote, or purports to have written, and I
What
hope
do you mean purports to have
because I
written?
hope you haven't.
But you know
I hope you haven't written the book,
claiming I
but
didn't
you
write
have
the
to
book.
let me finish.
I mean, I have all my
You had
handwritten
you had
drafts. You can
5
see that.
minutes. You had 5 minutes.
What are you
You had
saying?
5 minutes. Allow me to finish.
Reports to written.
You know, Mr. Dershowitz, just an aside note, you say you had some input in UN Resolution 242.
Right.
Now, if somebody had some input into UN Resolution 242, you have to have known who the main framers were.
Absolutely.
They were Arthur Goldberg.
Right. Who was
And
my
who?
boss.
And
when I
who was the
he was my law
second?
clerk.
Who was the second?
Oh, I think his name was Lord Shawcroft, the British ambassador.
Lord who?
I don't remember.
Right, you had input.
A long,
Yeah, now
1967.
no, I know, Mr.
It's
Dershowitz.
he cited in my book.
I know he cited, and you know who you cite?
Right.
You cite Lord Carrington.
Carrington.
Yeah, but you know what, Mr. Dershowitz? It was Lord Carradine. You don't even know who you're talking about.
Oh, you know,
You
that's
don't
so
have
absurd.
the vaguest
Arthur Goldberg
idea.
was my dear friend.
I know. You
We
had
spoke
input
on the phone.
You had input in the
Right,
resolution,
right.
and you
I
have
did.
no idea who the person is. He says Lord Shawcroft here. He says
Because
Lord.
I
He
had
says
no
in my book
contact.
is Lord Carrington.
Because I
You
had no
said you had
contact
input
with Arthur
Yeah,
Goldberg. I was
Mr.
very,
Mr.
very
Dershowitz,
clear. Arthur Goldberg
it's
was my
painful.
friend. He
Mr.
called me. He
Dershowitz,
was the UN ambassador.
it's painful.
He asked me advice
to let me
about
finish.
this.
He had a
I had
summary.
no contact with any lords from Britain, obviously. All I had contact with was Arthur Goldberg. That's all I claim. That's the
If
fact.
you can
and
finish your
that's
conclusion.
true.
Okay. As I said, you cannot have a discussion about the Nazi Holocaust with a Holocaust denier.
That's right.
You can't have a discussion about the Israel-Palestine conflict with somebody who didn't produce a hoax, who plagiarized one. You can't have a serious discussion
I
on
did
that
not
topic.
plagiarize a
That's
single
number one.
word, and you
Number
know that.
two, Mr. Dershowitz says, I'm on the extreme end.
You are.
He's in the mainstream.
Right.
I hope people will listen to the evidence. He cited a hoax. I cite the scholarly sources. Mr. Dershowitz says he doesn't agree with the human rights organizations.
On some issues.
I quote B'Tselem, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International.
And so do
and
I,
if
by
I
the
had
way.
the time, you quote them to dismiss them.
No, sometimes I agree
No,
with them.
Mr. Dershowitz, I read your book.
Sometimes
I think
agree
I
with
know
them.
your
You'll
book
see,
better
I
than you
sometimes
do.
agree with them.
Let
I'm
him
sure you
finish
think
his
you do.
conclusion. Let him
Finish.
finish